Hello again and a very warm welcome. My name is Don McGurgan and you're very welcome to our weekly podcast here on Sweet Omagh Town Internet Radio. And as I roll up my garage door, I welcome Mr. Declan Ford. Hello Mr. Ford, do you hear us today? You do?
Oh, I do indeed. I do indeed.
And how are you coping with our little garage?
Well, it's not as warm as it had been last week. But that's maybe because I was wearing a coat.
Yes.
And
it's tidy,
it has a certain atmosphere.
Well, you know, you're not sitting on the lawnmower tonight.
Thankfully not.
No.
I'm just sitting on bare concrete, actually.
Well, clean, bare concrete.
Clean, bare concrete. And I can vaguely make out things in the distance. There's a crack in the window. Or
it's called a cobweb.
A cobweb. I think I see something moving in the corner.
I bet you do, hey. You would. Hungry eyes see far. Anyway, leave well enough alone. My little mice will...
A mouse.
Hedgehog. Anyway, how is life with yourself?
Life is grand. Once I heat up, I'll be all right, you know.
I know.
You know, and I thank you very much for the tea.
You're very welcome. I could see you heading up the driveway, and I said, I'll have this kettle boiled behind Mr. Ford. Gets out of his car, limps a bit, and looks round, and then I put up the roller door.
Yes.
And you fiddle about for the light that you never can find.
That's right.
And then you think, oh, this has been tidied up since you were here last.
Do you know how things have changed? Do you remember when a man would always have a box of matches in his pocket? Or a penknife? Or bits of string? You know.
Sounds like my car.
See, the next time I come here, I'm going to equip myself with a penknife, a bit of string, and a box of matches.
Okay.
Because I can never find the light in this tip. And it's getting too much, to be honest. I mean, if this coronavirus goes on much longer, I don't think there's only so many nights a man can sit in your garage, shivering, talking to the mice.
Okay, I will press the circuit breaker personally, Mr. Ford, and lock you out. Then you just talk to me on the phone, and you'll have more manners because I can turn you up and down there.
On the telephone?
Yes, I will just say, no more, Mr. Ford. Up you go or down you go.
Right.
You sit here and you just take advantage of me here.
You'll be like that moderator at that woeful, awful, dreadful debate between Trump and Biden.
I saw it on YouTube though, and you said about it. I couldn't believe it.
Oh, aye. But why they do not bring in just an on-off button for the microphone and let them gulder and roar away, and where nothing would come out? You know, it's beyond me.
It debases politics. You know, I think when. Years ago, you always thought people went into politics to say, how may I serve? And I tell you, there's nothing much in that debate that would say those people are thinking anything other than what they can get out of it for themselves.
And you know, politics is increasingly, well, in America anyhow, and to some extent, and this, not necessarily this neck of the woods, but in our near neighbours, you know, it's a sort of a step on to entertainment.
That's the problem. I think the lines are blurred. I think if you have a good television presence and a good orator and stuff like that somehow that can get you elected. Where years ago you didn't, you had to deliver as well.
Yeah, and increased. And I think it started with John F. Kennedy. You know
him and Nixon. Yeah,
that Nixon debate.
Yes,
and you know the increasingly politicians were judged according to their looks, regardless of their politics, and then of course when Reagan was elected, then it became it was sheer entertainment in the White House. Though I think Reagan kind of fooled a lot of people because he was a very well read man and he had a great grasp of history, but he came across as this bumbling, kind of slightly inarticulate, genial great uncle.
Yes,
you know, but he was the kind of a last of an old breed. But he knew how to work an audience and how to use the microphone.
Yes.
The old actor skills.
Yeah, I watched some old ads he would have done on YouTube as well.
Right.
You know, when he actually sold things, that was the style, that was the personality. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you know, selling cigarettes, Chesterfield cigarettes.
Was it?
Things like that. Oh. You know what I just saw recently? Do you see during the First World War, American soldiers were given cigarettes as part of their rations?
And yes, there were. Yes.
Imagine that. Imagine that. Tell me this, did you ever smoke yourself?
I certainly did. I learned to smoke at 11 years of age.
11 years of age. What did you smoke?
I smoked Benson and Hedges and then Sterling, Sweet Afton.
Upmarket.
I was really feeling good. Gallagher Tips. Red. Gallagher Tips.
You never took the untipped? The Gallagher Greens or Gallagher Blues?
Only if I stolen from my dad. Hope he's happy.
Right.
He used to go into his little bedroom, and then he had one of these like solid cigarette cases when he felt like, you know, when he's gone out at night with his friends and stuff.
Oh yes, very classy.
He'd take he had a 20 packet of Gallagher Plain, I think you called them.
Right.
But you're really hard up when you take one of those now.
Right.
But he turned a blind eye. He never said nothing to us, but he obviously knew we did it.
Well, I was caught. Confirmation. You know the money you were given, when you went round with bag and bowl to relatives that you would never visit normally.
Oh, kind aunts, yes. You have to kiss them on the cheek and all to get it.
Yes, and you go down and you try and look pious. And you'd have your hair, what do they call it, a duck's tail or whatever, that you use your saliva.
Your mother spitting the comb.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or if you were lucky, Brill cream.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And you'd go round in your wee suit.
Yes.
And your wee knobbly knees. Yeah. And you were holy.
Yes. And you took the pledge.
And you took the pledge. I had no notion what I was doing. But anyway, I took the pledge anyhow. And what little money I got, I suddenly discovered friends that I never knew I had. And we juked out afterwards. And I must admit, I purchased a packet of cigarettes. And I thought we had smoked them all and were duly sick, but came home anyhow, and my mother discovered the wee bits of tobacco in the pocket. And that was me.
And you couldn't lie either, you say?
I couldn't, not because I was in a state of grace.
Of course. Aye, well, at our confirmation you had to make a pledge that you wouldn't take alcohol. But I took the pledge again.
Did you really?
Last Saturday morning, actually.
Oh, do you tell me?
Well, all happened on Friday night. I came in late on Friday night.
Right.
I've been a single resident of this house. No one here to clean. I don't have any lady coming in or something.
Right,
to clean up
I
from.
know.
So I had my little.
Well, I have
my little. I had my little jar of pledge. And I dusted around the bathroom sink and all the rest. Right. And then the phone rang. The landline rang. I couldn't find the landline because it's a wee mobile phone or a wee cordless phone. And when eventually I got it, I sat down and talked to somebody for about an hour. And I forgot all about that. The next morning I got up and took my shower, got out, and the bathrooms gets all steamed up.
Yes.
I put my hand out thinking I'd been on my links.
Right.
I sprayed myself with the pledge.
Ooh, I bet you've never been as shiny in your life.
Back into the shower, then I was slipping around the bath because it's an oil base.
Right.
And then my daughter calls me Mr. Sheen from now on. Well. Anyway. That couldn't happen to a nicer fella.
Oh, exactly.
Anyway, our subject of tonight's programme is going to be without Mr. Ford again, I hate to say. It's nothing personal, Declan.
That's okay.
Trust me. Some time ago, you and I talked about an interview we'd done about the Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital.
Yes.
With the late Peter Kelly and Brian Mullen.
Mm-hmm.
And we said we had another interview in the store somewhere, and this will be it today. And it's a lecture given for the West Tyrone Historical Society sometime, I'm not sure, Declan, it could be 15, 20 years ago maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And the gentleman talked at length about his career in the hospital and the whole history of the hospital, and you're going to hear a very entertaining interview. And it's going to take a wee while. It takes about a little over an hour, maybe an hour and 20 minutes for his lecture. So if you feel like getting yourself ready before you listen to this, or stop it halfway through, we're going to keep it up for as long as necessary. And certainly anyone who's interested or has ever worked in the hospital will be fascinated by his revelations.
Mm-hmm. And the great thing about it being on this site, people can dip in and out.
Yes.
And that's important.
It is indeed, aye. Yeah. It is an interesting programme, and it may take a while, it's certainly well worthwhile.
Yeah, because the T&F, it has a fascinating history, and it is such an imposing building even now.
Yes.
Its use has changed over the years. Yes. And do you remember, was it Peter Kelly or Brian Mullen that described the two camps in Omagh? One was the army camp at one side of the town, and the other was the the T&F, and
Yes.
that they both were self-sufficient.
Yes.
They were almost separate entities into themselves
That's
from the
absolutely-
town.
Yeah, and there were two villages in the town, really, because I mean the staff and the patients and all would have made up the size of a good village, and the same with the camp at Lisnelly Barracks, and that they were never really visual to the town because obviously for security reasons we never really saw, but you knew the number of people that lived there.
That's right, and I mean, when you think of the way that the health service provision has changed here,
Yes.
from the old General Hospital. I mean, do you remember it?
Oh, very well, yes. Yeah.
On the site of the old workhouse.
Yeah.
And it then became the Fever Hospital around the 1840s, the 1850s. And some of the older generation would still refer to it as the Fevery Hospital.
Yes, indeed, it was known there.
Because it became the General Hospital, and then the county, of course, so...
Yeah, it has come and went as well, I suppose, in a short number of years, really. Because the old hospital was somewhere up by Market Street, High Street.
I think the first infirmary was up there in the late 1790s, and I seem to recollect reading recently that the county hospital has been sold.
Oh.
I mean, it's been on the market for some time.
Can you tell us?
I think it was to be announced, or it is to be announced fairly soon, from what I picked up, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Oh, it's a beautiful, imposing building. It doesn't look well fenced up with a sort of galvanised front and all to it, because the beautiful gardens and all have sort of disintegrated back to nature, really.
Yeah. No, so
Bit like my garden.
Sure, isn't that what happens?
This is nature wins.
Yeah, well, look, in the end nature always will win.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, look, till we see you again, Mr. Ford, thank you for your contribution here.
Yes, and thank you for the very cold Treacle Lake tea. It was much appreciated.
Oh, well.
Bit solid, but...
At least the milk was fresh.
When you bought it.
Well, still within date, or near enough it. What's a few weeks among friends? Okay, Declan, till we see you again, we'll leave you in the company of the late and great Bob McKinley as he takes us on a wonderful tour of the Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. To see you again, take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.
Our first evening of the new session. A very warm welcome to members and their guests, and I hope we've representatives from the Omagh Family History Society here. Any hands going up? Thank you. We were looking for strangers in our midst, and you're no stranger. Right, they may still arrive. Now, this evening, Mr. Robert McKinley, well known and well endeared to the Society, is coming along to talk about the place that he knew so well between joining the T&F Hospital in 1953 as a salaries and wages clerk and rising up to dizzy heights in 1986 before his retirement. Now, any other person working at the T&F might have just gone 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock and just done his job. This man here, of course, busied himself finding out a wee bit of this, a wee bit of that about the history of the place. Maybe it was a bulwark against boredom, I don't know. But we should give a warm welcome to Robert McKinley for his history of T&F.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's that man again. Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, Omagh Mental Hospital, Omagh District Lunatic Asylum. Those were the three official names. The unofficial names were Nuts Corner and the Big House. And the odd thing was that the Big House was a euphemism which was widely practiced even with the patients in the hospital. If I had talked to a patient over at the clinic and said, "Where's so-and-so?" "He's over in the Big House." And out through the countryside, it was tacitly accepted that when somebody was in the mental, he didn't say the mental, he said, "You know, he's up in the Big House." However, prior to the building of asylums, there was little or no provision for the insane. And there's an act of 1634, and there's a provision for houses of correction. Now, you had to be well qualified to get into one of these houses of correction. And I'll let you know what the qualifications were to get into the houses of correction. Persons calling themselves scholars, going about begging. Idle persons about begging or using subtle crafts, fortune tellers. Persons being or uttering themselves to be collectors for jails, fencers, bear wards, and minstrels. Jugglers, labourers able but refusing to work at reasonable wages. Persons delivered out of jail that beg for their fees, or that otherwise travel begging. Pretenders to loss by fire, and gypsies. And if that list wasn't sufficient to get you into a house of correction, the next year there was 2 more enactments applied, and they were for cosherers. That was the fellow who wields the cosh. And wanderers, intimidating persons into giving lodgings and food by threats of some scandalous rhyme or song. So now you just didn't get into the house of correction without having a right old pedigree. And no doubt the house of correction needed an awful lot of correcting. Anyway, these together with the jails, these houses of correction together with the jails were the only repositories for the insane. Outside that, the people had about 3 options. One was to pay for a private lunatic asylum. And around about the middle 1700s, there were 7, about 7 in Dublin. And they ranged from 30 guineas a year to 100 guineas a year. Now, the affluent people who could pay the 100 guineas a year, their relative, patient, call them what you will, had the use of 2 rooms and a personal servant. And they had to supply their own bedding, with the result that you got a variety of bedding from a mattress on the floor to a 4-poster. Now, the paupers that were there, they weren't allowed to associate with the fee-paying inmates or patients, and they only could do manual work or menial work. So, this was the only repository for the insane. But then there was 2 other options. One option was that the families looked after the insane themselves, and some of the big houses had the so-called locked room, where the disgrace to the family was housed. But the less affluent, out in the country especially, there was a big hole dug in the middle of the floor in the room that was covered over with poles, lattice work of poles, and they were known as cribs. And the poor creature was confined to these cribs. And Chairman, where's the Chairman? Chairman, you'd be interested to know that on the Drumquin side of where you used to live at Barnescourt, there was a bridge, and there's an iron ring in that bridge. Now, the people of today wouldn't know about it, but when I was at Barnescourt in the early 30s, the old men talked about Neddy Cribb's Bridge. And Neddy was one of these unfortunate that lived in a hole in the ground, and on a good weather, they brought him out and they chained him to the bridge, and he got a wee bit of sunshine about him, but it wasn't a nice thing to have. Now, there's another option, and the other option was dangerous lunatics. The rest of them either ran the roads, were housed in the big house or the crib or wherever, but the dangerous lunatic that was a danger to the public, or public lodge, they were lodged in jails. And there was a reprehensible practice sprung up. The people who had a person insane, a lunatic, that's what they called them in those days, there were no euphemisms in those days, they had a lunatic, they incited the lunatic to do some act, some violent act or other, with the result, plenty of seats at the front, folks. They're the dear seats, but come along. So they had their unfortunate relative, and they incited this relative to some act of violence or some such thing, and then they got them committed. So then they were put in jail, and that relieved them of the responsibility of the patient, and also the jails were free, so they were saving both ways. Now, In 1772, there were then houses of industry erected, and they were for locking up people, incarceration for a period of up to 4 years. And they were mainly for the country was abounding with beggars and nuisances that were referred to as nuisances, and that's what they were made for, the houses of industry. But unfortunately, they also became a repository for the insane as well. But from 1840 to 1845, there was 130 workhouses opened. And with the provision of the workhouses, the insane were accommodated there as well. Now we're coming up to Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. That's just a thumbnail sketch of what went on. In 1817, there was a very august body or authority in Dublin, and they were known as the Commissioners of General Control and Correspondence. But it was shortened to the Commissioners, so they were just referred to as the Commissioners. And they were given the task of establishing asylums. Now, the first intention was that there be one asylum for each province, as well as the Dublin one. And Ulster was to get one asylum. It was either to be in Belfast or Armagh. In Belfast, they put up their case that they had the most people, and they wanted it there. Armagh said, no, we're coming a far greater area than Belfast, we want it here. So therefore the Old Common Promise was arrived at, and Ulster got two. They got one in Belfast, and they got one in Armagh. Now the one in Armagh had to cover, as well as Armagh, had to cover Cavan, Monaghan and Fermanagh. So that was an awful distance, or an awful lot of ground for one house to look after. Anyway, by 1830, the provision of asylums were on the way. The original concept of asylums was a house for curables, and the incurables were still going to be left in jails or workhouses. And the original concept was that the asylums would be for people that there was a good chance of curing, but that just didn't work out. In the end, they were all lumped together. And it was interesting that the Board of Works, they decreed that the asylums were to be built to a pleasing design. They weren't to be austere, grim, fortress-looking buildings like the workhouses and the jails, but they were to be built in a style, of a gothic style, with ornamentation, and where possible have land attached. And some of them were so well ornamented and embellished that there was public criticism, especially the one in Sligo and the one in Cork. So now we come to what I came here to do, talk about Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. Now, the first charter or warrant was issued in 1847, and that was the middle year of the famine. But that had nothing at all to do with the erection of Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, or in those days Omagh District Lunatic Asylum. It was merely coincidental that the famine was on at the same time. Famine or not, the Tyrone and Fermanagh would have been built. And the original site was for 26 acres. And those that know the place could still see it. It comes from round from the bridge, round the wall, back to the back gate, across the back gate, down past the gardens, it follows the river right round. And that would have been the original site. And that doesn't mean much to a lot of people here, but to my friends from Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, they'll identify with it. Now the stones were from a quarry in Lack, and the architect was a man called William Farrell. The total cost of building and furnishing Omagh District Lunatic Asylum, that's what was known in those days, was £41,407, 12 shillings and twopence. So the first insurance was carried out, but they weren't all that slow in those days. They didn't insure it for 42,000. They insured the building for 11,000 and insured the furniture for 1,000. And the first annual premium was £7 and 10 shillings. Now the upkeep for Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital and the patients, it was derived from the cesspayers or the rates, and the relatives were also required to pay for patients where they had the means to do so. It was designed to accommodate 300 patients and was opened on the 3rd day of May 1853 for the first 30 patients, and they were mainly from Omagh Jail and the workhouse. And the number one on the books was Brian Corr of Omagh. Brian Corr, C-O-R-R. I don't want it to be mixed up with Brian Call. Now, 2 years later, on the 31st of March 1855, there was 142 patients from County Tyrone and 43 patients from County Fermanagh. So the original building that was designed for 300, and that was the front facade, not anything with buildings in the back at all, it was just the front facade. And that was, there was 142 plus 43, 185 in the building for 300. So at that stage in the game, they were comfortable, but that didn't last long. On the 1st of the 4th 45, the RMS reported that the grounds were still in a backward state. And the reason given was there were so many men required to work the river pump because the water was taken from the river for the patients, for the drinking water, for domestic supply, for everything. And there was not enough manpower to improve the grounds. The patients were employed in making roads, levelling ditches, breaking stones, lowering ground inside the boundary wall to prevent escape. Now that's an interesting thing. There's a regulation from the Board of Works in Dublin that the retaining wall round a mental hospital, a mental asylum, could only be 6 foot 6 inches high. Well, that's the height of a normal kitchen door. And the young active fellow, disturbed and in a hurry to get out, it wouldn't have proved an impossibility for him to rush over 6 foot 6. So the RMS had a bright idea. He got his band of patients and his keepers out together, and he sunk 3 feet down below the foundation of the wall, and that gave him a 9 foot 6 wall, and he was still within the regulations because the wall was still only 6 foot 6. And anybody that cares to look at the road, at the wall down from the main gate, will see that the grounds are a great deal lower than the road outside, and that was the reason, because it was dug 3 feet down, and then they had a 9 foot 6 wall, and that's would daunt most people. Now the spade work for the crop was all spade work. The amount of spades that went through in that place must have been phenomenal, and it was all for potatoes and oats. Now here's an interesting thing. The hay and oats were to be kept for the horse, as yet not purchased. But I have a suspicion that the RMS had a horse. And I have a suspicion that the RMS's horse was not averse to oats and hay grown at the lunatic asylum. However, the females who were employed in knitting, sewing, spinning, laundry and house cleaning. The lights were by oil lamps, and it cost 11 and 8 pence per night, 58 pence of today's money. And there was a request to the governors to install gas from the Omagh Gas Company at 7 and 6 100 feet, and that was reckoned to be one night's supply. And the laying of gas pipes from Omagh 1.5 miles would have cost £300, and it was considered that the interest of the 5% on the £300 was less than the price of the candles supplied to the RMS and the matron. Now, the staff at the inception of Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital was a resident physician, and that was Francis John West, MD, and he was a graduate of Edinburgh. There was a visiting physician, because it was decreed by the Board of Works that a mental hospital must also have a visiting physician. There was a matron, there was a clerk, storekeeper, he was a very important fellow. And then there's an apothecary for making up the drugs and the various medicines. And there's 3 chaplains, even at that stage. The attendants were a land steward, a gatekeeper, 7 assistants male, which included a weaver, a painter, and a carpenter. There was a hall porter, a fireman, a cook, and a laundress. There were 8 nurses. Oddly, the females were referred to as nurses, but the men were referred to as attendants or keepers. But there was 12 attendants, and they were also female, and there was a postboy, a total of 42 people. And that was how Tyrone and Fermanagh started off, with 42 people and virtually 187 members of staff. Now, 1854-55, I'm doing this in a chronological way, the receipts from the paymaster of the civil service was £4,000, and other payments were £82. So we surmised £82 would be from relatives paying for the relatives paying for their patients and their family patients. But the expenditure was 4,102. So there were £20 over it. And that seems to be a common occurrence throughout all the health service, and this today yet even. In 1856 we got round and we installed gas. You forgive me for saying we, because I still feel a part of the place. We installed gas and we were recorded as feeding pigs. 56 to 57 we had problems with the hot water through the building, the baths, etc. They had to carry it all, and they had problems that it wasn't heating well enough, and it's recorded there was intense cold in the corridors and the sleeping apartments. There was 44 degrees in the corridors and 48 in the dormitories, and that would make most folks shiver. 57, 58 we had 241 patients. We were creeping up, and the patient cost in 1957 was £21.12 and 7 a head, but the next year it had dropped to £19.5 and 11. So there's economies going on there somewhere. They had, up that date they had 4 cows. They got up as far as 4 cows. And the RMS's salary was £300 a year plus vegetables and a half gallon of milk. Now later on in the talk we'll discover about what the RMS got for himself. Round about the 60 time they changed to steam heating, and there was a library established in 1859 and 60. This is a remarkable thing I found. This is the first reference I've got to it. In 60-61 reports, there was 266 patients, and there was the first mention of padded cells and straitjackets. That's the first time I've come across restraints of any kind, and that was 59-60. But they had established a library at that time, so they weren't doing so bad. They were moving forward. 61-62. This is a remarkable, to me it was remarkable. It mightn't be so remarkable to you people, but the contract price for nails. Now, nails, as we know today, nails are inch, inch and a half, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch, 5 inch, 6 inch. But at that time, they contracted for 4-penny nails, 6-penny nails, 8-penny, 10-penny, 12 pence, 15 pence, 20 pence, 2 shillings, half a crown, and 5 shilling nails. I have asked many people, had they ever heard of it? And no one has ever heard of nails being described in that fashion. But there it is to be seen. But I was talking to the late Jack Scott, who was a council foreman, maintenance foreman, and he said when he was in Canada, he discovered that nails were described in his part of Canada as 2-penny, 4-penny, 6-penny, 8-penny, and so on. But I thought it was an interesting thing, because anyone ever I've spoken to locally around, even the oldest of men, never heard tell of these type of nails. At that time, they proposed a half an acre, that half an acre would be left aside for a cemetery. But that didn't happen for a long time. One has to remember that there weren't all that many burials out of the hospital that the hospital had to carry out, because most people had relatives somewhere, and even if they had put them in the mental, at the end of the day, public opinion and dignity decreed that you buried your own. However, in 61-62, they were thinking about the cemetery. And also, they reckon they put past £25 for band instruments. There again, they were thinking about the music for the patients, the entertainment for the patients. They had a library, and they were thinking ahead of themselves. But the ugly spectre of overcrowding appeared. They had 310 patients at that particular time, and the hospital was built for 300. 64-65, they had rented 20 acres at £1 1 shilling an acre. You wouldn't get it much for £1 1 shilling in the land of market today, but that's beside the point. The inspector, he was a very important fellow, and he was very uptight, because he discovered on his inspection that they were using the hospital, the infirmary. That's the one above the church. As you go in on your left, it's known now as Grove House, or was when I was there. And they found they were using it for thrashing corn and storing corn. And the inspector was very irate, for apart from it being a menace for rats and mice and vermin and all, it cost £1,500, and he was a very displeased person to find that they were thrashing corn in the infirmary. Also, in the same period, we discovered that the patients walked in the country accompanied by a band. And the inspector he recommended enlarging the building to ease the overcrowding, and it always seemed to take quite a period of time between the recommendation and anything happening. But he also recommended in 65, 66, 67 that they purchase 30 acres at £75 an acre. They would enlarge a dormitory for £750, or a factory for £800, and incidentals at £200, and that amounted to £4,000, and that would be a farthing on the rates. But that was turned down by the governors. For the simple reason the governors were the biggest ratepayers, and they weren't going to have their rates increased by a farthing and a pound just to provide facilities for mental patients. Water was always a problem at Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital for up to 1936. So they put in a filter machine to filter the river water because it was the drinking water, and they had got up to 358 patients then, and it was still the old 300 building. But anyway, there was a contract put out then for an extra 200 patients, and the contract price was £10,635 and 10 shillings. And the work commenced in September of 1868, but owing to the crowded conditions in the hospital, the padded cells were used as sleeping apartments. The new building was under construction, and they always had problem with the water, so they sank a well of 90 feet. And it was pumped by the new steam engine, and it provided 86,000 gallons of water for every 24 hours. And the new accommodation was being occupied at that particular time. Well, then there was a bit of a hiccup. The Killyclougher parish priest refused to bury the dead. He refused point blank. Very probably had his reasons. Maybe he thought he wasn't getting paid enough. We don't know. But he refused to bury the dead, and the RMS was very irate because some poor creature had died, and they had carted them around the countryside trying to get him buried. In the end, they got him buried somewhere about Edenderry. But he said he had take umbrage that it was a lamentable state of affairs that you had to cart a patient around the countryside to get him buried. And that would have pushed the provision of the new cemetery on at that particular time. Now, 73, the boundary wall was built including the new farm. Because in 72, they had bought 22 acres, and now that gave them a total of 52 acres. And that probably was the 20 acres that they had rented for the few years before that. They likely had rented it and then they had bought it. And the boundary wall was built enclosing the new farm. But another fly in the ointment was the workhouse were dumping patients in Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. In other words, they were saving their books and their charges and dumping them in Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, and that was taken great exception to. But the rubber pumps now were working by steam, and that released some of the patients from the old job. But here they were in trouble again. That's such a high lime content, furred the pipes and what have you. But we're up to 462 patients then. But it wasn't so bad because we had got accommodation for another 200. 1874 was a welcome year from the finance department. The government gave a grant of 4 shillings per patient per week for pauper asylums, and that amounted to £5,000 a year. And that was a big lift to them from the rates, the payment of rates and the cesspayers. That was a great help to them. And at that particular year, the expenditure was £9,324, 10 shillings, and the patient costs was £18.15 and 11 pence. And that's £3 per patient cheaper than it was in 16 years before in 58. So the 4 shillings a week made a vast difference to the finances of the hospital. In 1875, there were 498 patients, so we were just tickling the 500 mark again. We were creeping up. And it's recorded that 22 patients had received douche baths, in other words, submerged in cold water to settle their nerves. But there's a brighter side. At that time we'd got a horse, he cost £30. We'd 9 cows for £135. And with 16 pigs for £50. We were getting on. And the inspector, he suggested renting 2 fields on the other side of the river, 12 acres and possible purchase, and also having Omagh water supply extended to the asylum, because, as I said, they always had diffs with the water. 76 or 40 patients employed in the farm, and the RMS had gone up to £600 per annum, and that was a lot of money. in 1876. But there was fines on the servants that year of 10 shillings. They had the authority to fine the workers. If they stepped out of the line, they had the authority to fine them. The famous Dr. West, he was ill, and it was reported by the clerk, who was a C.J. McMullen, that he had to have 1 month's leave of absence at the sea, and his son did the RMS duties. There's nothing like keeping it in the family, if you can at all. 1879 was considered admissions at a peak. This is laughable. They considered admissions at a peak, and no further enlargement of the asylum was required. How little they knew. But here's an interesting thing. Night soil, that is the sewage from the place, it was utilised as irrigation for 6 acres. And do you ever stop to think, in 1876, or 1879, there was no vacuum pumps, there was no slurry tankers. How did they irrigate the night soil on the 6 acres? And that would be the 6 acres over the wall, up around the river in front of the RMS's house. And I reckon the only way it was done was the old, anybody remember the old spray carts that had the huge barrel on? But I reckon they had a huge barrel on the cart and a dribble bar behind, and that's how they irrigated the 6 acres. But I don't think anybody has ever heard of irrigation of sewage as early as 1879. Their thoughts always turned to economising. So they reckoned they would use the town reservoir instead of the engine pumping river from the well. And now we had passed the 500 mark. We were up to 504. And not very long ago, we considered that admissions were at the peak and there was no further call for enlargement. 1880 was a sad year for the place, for the famous Dr. Francis West. He died after 28 years service. There was a George Carr appointed, and he was promoted from Castlebar District Asylum at £500 a year. After all, the dead man, he was getting 600 plus the rations, but the new man came in at 500. And we dropped a little bit then because we were down to 485 patients. In 81, there was a dense portable telltale clock installed to record duty performance. And that was a clock that where the attendants, the keepers, at a certain time, especially at night time, had to punch the clock, and that was recorded, and the clock was kept in the boardroom where the RMS had his office, and he was able to come in, or somebody else was able to come in and check the roll to see that the man punched the time when he was awake and well at a certain time in the ward at a certain place, and that dense portable telltale clock was installed. However, despite the £25 for the musical instruments and the band that walked with the patients, in 81, the only musical instrument was a concertina. And the patients enjoyed the dance, but they grumbled at the music. It wasn't great. Anyway, they decided to have a water supply from Omagh Waterworks and to erect hydrants and have fire hoses. And the following year, the recreation ground was fenced in. And that's the bit just as you go in, and it's the ground in on your left as you go around the back of the hospital. And the carpenter shop and the smithy was built, and now we had got the 526 patients. We were starting to head for the corridors again. 1985, overcrowding. So the position was reversed. There was 18 patients discharged to the workhouse, and I bet they enjoyed that. The town water was cut off from the asylum except for fires, etc., because there was deficiency in distribution to the town. Well, Omagh town always had a problem, and then when we got linked up to the Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, they had a greater problem. So it was cut off again, unless there was a fire. And the inspector, he came along and he said, this bread is bad. He tasted the bread, and the bread was bad, and if he said it was bad, it's got to be bad. And he recommended that they bake their own and set up an asylum bakery. And there's 64 feet of water in the well, and that's a lot of water in the well. And the standby pump at that particular time was installed. But our new Dr. Carr, at 1886, he was up to 600 a year, so he had made the grade. He was back up. 87, there was 532 patients, and the male division was completely overcrowded, and the inspector suggested acquiring 40 to 60 acres adjoining the entrance. And that would be the land across the road from the entrance where the MEH is built today. We'll come to that later. And the 13 patients were sent to the workhouse, and 14 patients were sent to the relatives. So they were trying to cut the numbers down a bit and ease the overcrowding. And the government grant was 4 shillings a week, and that cut the ratepayers to only £5, 1 shilling and 11 pence a head. So they're really coming down from £25 20 years before, and we're down now to £5, 1 and 11 pence per head. But the first crack in the system was starting to appear. The RMS was a man who lived in great style with his horse and carriage, with his beautiful mansion of a house, and he had this little empire of his own, and that created a lot of resentment amongst the good people of Omagh. And in 1888, a ratepayer by the name of William Bell, he objected to the rations issued to the RMS as being far in excess of the authorised scale. However, there was an inquiry by the auditor who discovered there were no grounds for objection. There's nothing like sticking together when you're in a tight spot. In 1889, the first Asylum athletic sports were held on the 15th day of August. And there was a large number of patients competed. And there was 200 looking on. And we had a military band in attendance. It was a big day for everyone. But this is a nice one. The same year, a manipan was purchased to supply music for the weekly dance. They also ordered swings. I never could understand why they ordered swings, but they did. But a manipan was purchased. Now, what's a manipan? I don't know what a manipan is. No one can tell me what a manipan is. But the gramophone was invented 1887, just 2 years before. So I think we can safely assume it was maybe it's a trade name for a gramophone in those days. So they bought the gramophone, come manipan, call it what you will, and that was to provide music for the patients' dances. So they had improved on the concertina a bit. The inspector, he come along again and he said, boys, this isn't good enough. Bread and milk for the breakfast should be increased. 1/3 of a quart for breakfast is below par. It's not good enough for a working man. In other words, if a man's going to work, he's got to be fed. And here, oddly enough, we get the first mention of wire nails being purchased instead of the 2penny, 4penny, 6penny, 8pence, and they were bought at 1 6 a stone, and the steel nails were 1 8 a stone. And arrangements were made to purchase the land at the entrance from Major Stewart of 84 acres, and that was bought in 1890, and that's the land across from the main entrance where the MEH is now built, and that was bought from Major Stewart in 1890. Now, I haven't a price for it. Possibly if I had recourse to the old ministers themselves, but they're up in the PRO office, I might have got the price for it, which would have been interesting. And at that particular time, 89, we had 1 horse, 12 cows and 19 pigs. And 14 years before, we had 1 horse, 9 cows and 16 pigs. So we hadn't really increased the stock all that much. We're up to 584 patients in 1893. Away shit goes again. And this is a good one. Mr. William Bell hadn't let go of his bone about objecting to the RMS and getting too many rations. Because there was a deputation from ratepayers in Omagh objecting to the annual allowances to the RMS being excessive. No action was taken. But they were fit, they must have good inside information. They said that supply to the RMS for the year was 31 tons 700 of coal. That's an awful lot of burning. There was 730 gallons of sweet milk. There was 847.5 loaves, which amounted to 2,180 pounds, which is nearly a ton. And there's 365 stones of potatoes, and he had 941 articles washed in the laundry. And furthermore, he had an attendant employed at full time in the RMS gardens and other duties. Well, if you break that down, he was burning 1,200 of coal a week. He was drinking 2 gallons of milk per day and eating 2 1/3 loaves per day. Maybe the ratepayers had something to talk about. And this is the first time I come across a disciplinary action here, apart from having been fined, and there was an attendant dismissed for kicking a patient. And at that stage in the game, we had 118 patients working in the farms and gardens. So now that was an awful lot of folk out, and every man Jack nearly would have had a spade. And that's the first mention we have, or I can find, of the service of a bull. How they looked after the 3 cows before that, I haven't a clue. There was no AI in those days. And also, it refers to the spraying of potatoes by copper sulphate and vet's fees. And that is the first instance, the first time I can find any reference to vets, bulls, or anything else. But we'd gone up 2 cows, 2 horses to 20 cows, and we were up to 31 pigs. But we're going to build a new piggery, and we built a new piggery for 50 pigs. And another innovation came to pass. The patients attended the circus, and that must have been a big day for both the patients and the circus. And the RMS reports that the want of a padded room was an awful drawback. So I suppose that many folk in them had to use them for sleeping accommodation. And the storekeeper, bad boy, he was required to pay £13, 16 shillings and 7 in respect of deficiencies in the stock of wines, whisky and porter. He was a thirsty storekeeper, clerk. At that time we were up to 68. Remember, we started off with 42. We're up to 68 staff now employed. And they were starting to get a bit upmarket with training, and attendants were required after 2-year service to pass an exam for the Medico-Psychological Association, which is known as the MPA, and there would be no promotion without passing that exam. The odd thing is, those who in later years did pass the exam, they received £1 per annum for passing the exam. In those days, I think they called it the badge. They got the badge. There were new buildings on the female side, and the inspector advised a fire engine for staff training. There wasn't much sense in having a fire engine when they hadn't the water, but that doesn't deter the inspector from recommending that. 1894. The chapel, which was an all-purpose chapel, served all the creeds and classes, and it was in the centre of the building. It was later transferred into patient staff accommodation and later into the school of nursing. But the original concept was that the chapel was in the middle of the building, and it served all creeds and classes. But the inspector advised a new chapel, because the existing one of 60 feet by 22 feet only held 130 persons, and was too small for Roman Catholic attendance at Mass, and suggested a new church. That was in 94. That year's expenditure was £12,078, 17 shillings and 6 pence, and there still was no ploughing done at Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital in 1894. But there was 36 acres under the spade. Now just you imagine 36 acres, and that's a power of digging, no matter how you look at it. But there was no talking about ploughing. In other words, the spade work was occupational therapy for the patients. It kept the patients busy. And just for information, not very valuable, but the population of Tyrone at that time was 171,401, and Fermanagh was 74,170. 2 horses, 27 cows, and 31 pigs. Our stock was going up. We're getting better all the time. And in 1895, there was plans for the additional female building, and that'll be Ward 14. And there was going to be new shops for the tailors, the shoemakers, and upholsterers built. But here again, our friend inspector, he wasn't pleased with the beef and the meat. And he was very pleased to find that they were going to advertise for ox or heifer meat, not old cow as previously used. But our friend the storekeeper, the thirsty storekeeper, he was sacked for irregularities. So off he went. But I have no knowledge of the new fellow whether he drunk whiskey or not, but the old fellow, he got the boot. And in 1895, there was 2 acres and 3 roods reclaimed by the spade, and we can take it for granted that had been Major Stewart's land over behind the MEH, and the land would have been in bog at that particular time, bog and heather, and those 2 acres and 3 roods reclaimed by the spade. In 1896, staff that passed the MPA got £1 a year extra, and they had 3 roods of the bog reclaimed and 4 acres drained. But they hadn't finished that because the patients were engaged in excavating and levelling for the new buildings. Whenever they had a contract for a new building, the site works were done by the patients. The contractor came in and he did the building, but the site works, they were carried out by patient labour. And I must imagine, or I can't otherwise than imagine, but that must have been a long, laborious, time-wasting effort. There was no JCBs, bulldozers in those days. It was all spade work and patience. In 1887, they had a flu epidemic, and the new tailor shop was used as a temporary hospital, and they had to get in trained nurses from the Royal Hospital, and they were put in charge. The trained general nurses were brought in from the Royal Hospital in Belfast, and they were put in charge of the flu epidemic. And the unfinished female infirmary was handed over by the contractor to house the sick and infirm male patients. So it must have been a fairly drastic flu epidemic. And the death rate on record was the highest on record. 96 died in that particular year. Now, let's think about this. The building started in 1895, was still not finished. And it was delayed by strikes. So between the contractor having strikes in his hand, the building's been taken over, unfinished buildings taken over for sick people, and the site works having to be made by patients. It was a long, slow, tedious performance. 1898, 67 patients died, and a large number from tuberculosis or consumption. And the old sanitary blocks, they were blamed for that, and they were removed. And lo and behold, the contractor was still not finished building the female hospital, Ward 14. But when it is completed, we'll hold 711 patients. And there's little reclamation of rough land on the new farm at that time, because the entire patient force was busy digging the holes for this new building and levelling and one thing and another. But this was a momentous year in the history of Fermanagh Hospital. The old governors were disbanded, and they were replaced by a joint committee of the county councils, Tyrone and Fermanagh, and they were a committee by the county council. So in effect, the old governors, they were disbanded, and the people who were paying the rates, the county council, they were put in charge then. Wise enough decision, I would have thought. And there was a plenum system for heating ventilation installed. That was more or less a hot air convection. And then here and there through the place you'll see a big square coming out, and there was heat coming up from the bottom, and it emanated from the corners of the building, and that was the plenum hot air system. And we had a 4-inch fire main encircled the entire asylum, but no water. The new general stores and the new laundry was erected, the hay shed on the farm, and there was new engines and pumps installed, and we're up to 620 patients. And the new joint management of committee from the county councils, they were elected for a 3-year period, and we had 76 patients died that year, and the fears were that unless the isolation of TB and consumption, that cases could be arranged, the deaths would not decrease. Actually, the females were later, they were isolated, but the males were not isolated. They still carried on in their consumptive state. There was a rather odd, bizarre happening that year, the 1899, the steam engine. The steam engine was in the boiler house, of course, and the patients were walking along at the back of the hospital, and this fellow, he took a mad fit, and he jumped straight through the window into the steam engine and got mixed up with the flywheel, and the steam engine won. So the poor patient got killed. He was killed instantaneously, and that was a rather remarkable incident. Anyone jumps through a window into a steam engine. It doesn't happen every day. And in 1899, they were hoping that the contractor would be out of the asylum by the 1st of May, because it was ongoing from 1894, and that must have been 5 years complete and utter chaos for the entire hospital. And the Ward 14 female, the main contractor was Cahoon with 34,865. And there was new sewage tanks cut because sewage was still a problem with pollution. And we are up to 82 staff. And the inspectors suggested building staff cottages. Now, that was 1899. Oddly enough, it didn't take so long to get round to staff cottages, but in 1899, the inspector recommended building staff cottages. Prior to that, everybody lived in. And to increase the dairy farm to be self-sufficient in milk. And this, in 1899, we get the first mention of a plough, but no ploughing done. Everything was still done by the spade. So in 1900, the Roman Catholic Church was built to hold 340 patients, and it was finished and in use. But that wasn't built or paid for by contract, it was paid for by measurement. So we must assume that Cahoon, who had the main job of doing Ward 14 on the female side, he gave a price by measurement, and he built the chapel. And like everything else, everything was underestimated, because it was built for 340 patients. But in 5 years later, the gallery was added for a further 110 patients, and that's the church you see there today at the present time. So that's 110 for 455, 450. And that's the capacity of that church. It is a lovely church. Now, Ward 14, the female infirmary, that was connected to the main building with a glass passage. And the people who are working there know what I'm talking about. The glass passage from 14 down to the main building. And the infectious hospital was attached, and it was cut off from the rest of the infirmary. Now, the RCs had got their chapel, and was proposed now to build a Protestant church, and it was going to cost £2,000. And to convert the existing chapel, that's the one I told you about, inside the hospital, to convert it into dormitories and staff facilities and patients and what have you, and it's going to cost another £2,000. That was on the cards then in 1900. We'd got into the present century. We're up to 650 acres, and we had 30 acres by the spade, and 134 patients were working on the farm. That was a full-time job for the most. This is an odd thing. In the dining hall, grace was sung by the attendants and patients. And some of the old senior staff can still remember in the late 40s, grace being sung. Now, I never heard grace being sung in the place, but in the late 40s, up to the late 40s, grace was still being sung in the dining halls at meals by both the attendants and staff. The musicality of it, I won't vouch for it, but it was being sung. And the inspector suggested providing knives and forks to those who were considered safe enough. And then there was attendant to 1 to every 15 patients, but the norm was 1 to 10, but Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital was 1 to 15. 1901 we were up to 737 patients, and there was improved conditions for the patients, and the suicidal and epileptic patients were sleeping in observation dormitories. The Protestant patients attended the 3 Protestant services, and that was a remarkable thing. The inspector couldn't understand why the Protestants going to church, there was the same crowd at the Church of Ireland, at the Presbyterian, the Methodist. But the story is, they just waited on. It was one of the entertainments of the week, and they just waited on and got the 3 services. And that year there was a patient died from anthrax, and they also had cases of erysipelas. But the 12 cottages were being built at Cranny, and was £2,000 borrowed. When the county council took over, they borrowed money for making improvements, whereas on the old governors there was a grant from the civil purse. And at that particular time, it was considered there were 17,000 patients originally. 17,000 patients in all the asylums in Ireland, and that had been planned for 5,000. And lunatics at large were reckoned to be 8,000, and those figures were calculated by the RAC. It was the local constable that sent in his report how many lunatics were at large, and as I said, that included the harmless and the softies, so you can take it with a pinch of salt. There may have been more, there may have been less, but that was the RAC's constable's job, was to, at one time in the year, to enumerate the mentally ill, and saying the softies, the lunatics, what have you, and that was his job. And restraint by belts was discontinued. We were getting a bit more humane, and tying a patient up, that was discontinued. No longer restrained by belts. And there was 31.5 acres by the spade, and an interesting thing, in that year, spades by contract were 1 7pence each. I reckon it would take £14 to buy a decent spade today, a spear in Jackson. And whisky was £1 a gallon. Not a lot. 1902, consumption TB carried off 26 patients, and the RMS asked for separate accommodation, but still wasn't forthcoming. And there was an old sewer found that was supposed to be removed during the alterations. And when they removed the old sewer, there was no typhoid after that. There was a law case about that later, and the contractor won, but I think maybe the contractor was at fault because that old sewer had been left in, and that was removed. The 12 new cottages were occupied by the married male attendants, but they were unwilling to pay rent. They saw no reason why they should pay rent for a new house. But the male side was overcrowded, but the new Protestant church hadn't been started, so therefore they couldn't make use of the old church, church in the main building, and they couldn't make use of it. But it was an improvement in things. There were some knives and forks provided. for the patients. But the ground was cleared for the new Protestant church, and there's 4 acres of land drained, and there's 34 acres under the spade. No ploughs yet, no ploughs yet. And the RMS was up to 660 plus all the coal, the milk and the bread, whatever he ate as well. 1903, the Protestant church chapel was built. Also a pigsty for 40 pigs were built. It was £188, and the tenants' cottages were found to be damp, and them only up. Walls cemented, and spoutings were relaid. An auditor reported legal costs of £466 were incurred by litigation with the contractors over the building contracts. Litigation was unsuccessful, and there was a decree for £2,019, 5 shillings and 4pence awarded to the contractor. At the same time, I think they had good cause, but they lost that battle. And we had 38 3/4 acres under spade with 702 patients. And the RMS reported the Asylum now had become popular and was no longer a disgrace. And the old and infirm was hived off. In other words, the old and infirm were hiving them off to the mental, and was no longer it was no longer an unpopular place. He reckoned there was no longer a stigma and no longer a disgrace. 1904, there's some isolation in the female consumptive patients, but as yet there's still no means to isolate the male patients. And the Protestant church was opened. And the old church, it was converted then to male dormitories, and we employed 163 acres on patients on the farm, and the inspector, he advised fire escapes. Well, it was more sensible to fire escapes than a ring pipe around the place and no water. The fire escapes, I think, was a better business. And there was an interesting thing at that particular time. There was in America, there was an awful lot of people deported from America, sent home from America as unwelcome in America, and they were mentally ill, and saying, call them what you will. And at that particular time, there was 1,500 in Ireland alone, but they were mainly around the ports at that time, Queenstown. Oddly enough, Killarney had a big increase. Why Killarney, I don't know, and the Port of Derry, they had them as well, and there was a few in Omagh, but the reason was that the American authorities saw their chance to get rid of a financial burden and deported 1,500 or thereabouts, and they were sent back and had to be absorbed in the asylums here. At 43 3/4 acres, but there's still no plough. We were still digging in 1904. Not 5, the veranda with the sunroof was erected at the female infirmary to facilitate the consumptive patients. And as I said, the gallery for 110 was erected in the chapel. The old church was converted to dormitories for to house 23 male patients and 30 male patients, and there's 8 cubicles for male attendants. On the ground floor, it was a high building, and they put a ceiling in it on another floor and divided it in 2. And it was the ground floor was used for dining accommodation for nurses and attendants. And that cost £500. And the four fire escapes, iron staircases, they were erected that year as well. But the committee, they were charged £13 and 10 shillings. There had been a cow carcass for eating had been diagnosed with TB, therefore couldn't be used, but they authorised the payment, and the auditor sanctioned or surcharged the committee £13.10 for paying for TB cow that wasn't used, or at least we hope it wasn't used. And with 48 paying patients at that particular time, they continued to increase, so there was a certain amount of truth in what the man said, that it was no longer an unpopular place, that people were starting to use it for its proper purpose. They claimed 11 acres, but was still reclaimed by the spade, and the RMS was still sitting at £660. 1906, there was a lot of expenditure at that particular year. The steam boilers, the engines, the pumps, the laundry machinery, the drying chambers, and the entire heating apparatus in the whole hospital was overhauled. And that, I would imagine, there could be some of the radiators of 1906 still in the place. And there was a rat infestation, and there was a great worry that they may carry germs, and that was recorded in the reports as well. In 1907, the sewage was piped direct to the river, and the inspector required the legality without purification. But we're lucky that the drinking water was drawn above the hospital, and the sewage went in below the hospital, so we were lucky in that respect. Now, tablecloths, he found tablecloths clean, knives and forks for all except the most troublesome, and the age limit for the cattle for the slaughter was 9 years. But the inspector was very sceptical, as the meat was tough and uninviting, and he thought perhaps when they were 9 years old it wasn't altogether true, because the meat was tough and uninviting. And with 26 acres under the spade and 1907, the first mention of ploughing with 19 acres under the plough. That was the first talk about ploughing. 1908 with accommodation for 710 beds, but the patients were 778, that's 68 over, and they were overcrowding, they were sleeping in the beds and the corridors, and the inspector suggested erecting inexpensive buildings on the farm to house the farm workers and to relieve the overcrowding, because there were 150 patients working on the farm. But the patients, they complained. They weren't getting enough potatoes to eat. They only got 2 1/3 pounds per day, so they were complaining. They weren't getting enough spuds. 6 acres of rough ground was brought into crop, and only 2 acres of rough land to be reclaimed, leaving 4 acres of deep bog, and there was 10 acres to the spade and 50 acres to the plough. The spade work was starting to diminish greatly. And in 1909, the committee recommended that 2 dormitories be built with wood and iron. Now that was just scaly enough recommendation to build dormitories with wood and iron, which was equivalent to what you'd house cattle in, but that recommendation was refused, and I would say rightly so. 1910, there was 836 patients. We were really coming up. And the day room was turned into dormitories for 20 beds, and they used the shed and the recreation ground as a day room. And there was 1 attendant to 20 patients and 1 nurse to 17 patients, and we're still 158 patients working on the farm. And the inspector suggested tea for the evening meal, as cocoa was not relished by the Irish people. Now, we acquired 23 acres arable and 12.5 of bog and rough plantation in that particular year, and that was probably Arvely, and that brought the acres up to 172 acres. We were getting into big time at that particular time. There's not very many places could have boasted 172 acres at that time of the year. 1911, there was an outbreak of typhoid. There was 96 cases, and there were 17 deaths. And this was blamed on overcrowding, faulty sewerage, polluted water, and in the 96 cases of typhoid, there's 12 attendants, 49 male patients, 11 nurses, and 24 female patients. There was 1 nurse died in that outbreak of typhoid. And there again, there was nursing staff brought in from Belfast and from the county infirmary. And we were back to getting water from the Omagh Waterworks, but there was artesian wells being sunk to get a satisfactory water supply, and they relayed the new sewers by a crowd called Maguire and Gatchell of Dublin, and they were iron and stoneware pipes, so they were trying to overcome the sewage problem, which was an ongoing problem for them. There was 130 men and 180 women taken for walks beyond the grounds from the 856 patients, and we had 5 acres by the spade and 86.5 acres by the plough. So really the plough was starting to work now. And but they subsoiled 18 acres by the spade. And the RMS was still sitting at £660, and there was 85 staff and 8 officers. So the patients were increasing, and so were the staff. In 1912, installed an air compressor to pump the water from artesian wells, which had got down to 187 feet. And there were 20 patients sleeping in the corridor, so we were in an overcrowding business again. And we were down to 1 patient, or up to 1 patient, 1 attendant to 18 patients, and 1 nurse to 16 females. But we still had cocoa for supper. We still hadn't got tea. And there was only 4 acres of rough land remaining to be reclaimed. And 1914, Dr. Carr retired after 39 years service, and Dr. Patrick, he was appointed, and he spent 33 years about the place. Now, the land across the river, it was bought in 1914, 40 acres. It was acquired for £300. And the acreage was now up to 211 acres. And there was a ferry established. In other words, there was a boat established to get from the back of the hospital over to the new land. That's where the villas are at the present time. That land was bought in 1914. And they were starting to think way ahead of themselves, because the railway ran through the top of that ground, and they were negotiating for a siding, for a hospital siding for the railway, to bring in heavy goods instead of having to cart it from Omagh with horse and cart. and they negotiated for a railway siding, but it never came to pass. But they had at least they got the new sewage works completed. In 1914, there was 230 patients working on the farms and gardens, and the pavilion was erected in the recreation ground, probably right down about the cricket pitch down there. The cow byres were built and had provision for 30 cows. They were really moving up now, but after 172 acres, why not? There was 827 patients, there was a drop in the numbers then, and they had built a concrete landing for the stage for the ferry boat. And the ferry boat was on chain, and they chained the ferry boat back and forward across the river to take the patients and staff across. And there was a band master employed in 1914 at £20 per annum, but he was non-resident. He was a visiting band master. During the war years, there's not an awful lot to record during the war years. There was a large implement shed erected at the farmyard, and the farmyard supplied the entire meat for the asylum. It had grown 40 acres of potatoes, and there's 48 acres of corn, and 14 acres of turnips. Well, you had to have turnips in those days to feed the cows. It was the common forage for cows in those days. 1916, we got attacked by swine fever, and the entire stock of pigs had to be slaughtered. And although they had over 170 acres, they rented 10 more acres for crop. And that was the last year contract prices were recorded. That's probably down on account of rising prices during the wartime, that there's nobody could guarantee a contract price for a year. So that was short-term buying and short-term contracts. In 17, they built an incinerator. And the most odd thing I come across was in the middle of a war in 1917, when the war was at one of its most great wars, one of its most critical stages, and all classes of iron, railings, you mentioned, were taken and used for scrap to make armaments. But Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital got a brand new set of entrance gates of iron. Brand new, and they were 10 foot high. And that was in the middle of a war, when everybody else was giving scrap and what have you, but T&F, Omagh Mental Hospital, Omagh District Lunatic Asylum, they got a brand new set of gates up there. 1918, everybody's aware of the great flu epidemic of the 1918. It was reputed to have killed more people than that died in the Great War, but it doesn't seem to affect the Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital at all. There's no record of any flu in Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. But 1919 was a watershed for the staff. The staff gained a shorter working week. And what was the shorter working week? It was reduced from 66 hours to 56 hours a week, and that was a shorter working week, 56 hours. I think at the present time about 37 and a half. But in 1919 there was a great reduction, and they were reduced from 66 hours to 56, with the result that they had to take on 15 more attendants and 15 nurses. And that was 30 more staff, and that gave them a staff of 108 staff and 10 officers. And they also rented 22 acres from a neighbouring farm. 1920 was another year that sticks out in the records because there was a strike. The staff went on strike, and yet the year before they had got reduced from 66 to 56, but they went on strike. But the reason they went on strike was that the authorities decided that they wouldn't have 3 consecutive days off in the fortnight, that they would work their 66 hours within the week, the 56 hours within the week, but they went on strike. But only two of the staff remained on duty. The strike only lasted 2 weeks, because the staff conceded the committee had the right to allocate the hours, 56 per week, and the officers and the patients maintained the services. Well, now there were a lot of strikes over the mental hospitals, Castle Bar and all the rest during that particular time, and hospitals went on strike for better terms and conditions. The war was over, people were expecting things better, the old regime was getting washed out, and they expected a better way of life, and there were strikes going on. Now, at that particular time, the inspector's reports were getting very skimpy. The man was retiring, he just wasn't bothering himself, so he wasn't telling us very much at that particular time. But the RMS had gone up to £800 a year, and the matron was at £120 a year, and the head attendant was £120 a year. There was parity between the matron and the head attendant, which in later years was known as the chief male nurse, and then later on nursing administrator. 1921, we have the first record of a cinema shows being entertained, and The new medical inspector was a Dr. Dawson, and he reported that the MPA instruction to nurses only, but not to male attendants. It was the females were going for the MPA, the medico-psychological exam, and it was only the female nurses were going for it. The males weren't bothering themselves, because it was still only £1 a year, and that £1 a year came on about 1894. So 25 or 26 years later, the £1 a year wasn't worth bothering, going to all that hassle for £1 a year. But that was then to be compulsory. And the attendant's wife, she took charge of the Gate Lodge for £10 a year, Gate Lodge with light and fuel free and a free house. And I'm sure that was a bit of a sinecure, because the attendant was getting his money, and his wife was sitting in the house attending the gate, and she was getting £10 a year, all found. It was very good. 1922, there's a great decrease in incidence of tuberculosis, but oddly enough, 1918, no word at all, but 1922, there's a great influenza epidemic, and there was 10 patients and 1 nurse died. That was 4 years after the 1918 epidemic. The St. Clair Terrace in Well down to 187 feet, from 187 to 400 feet. And that's a fair feat. That's a lot of feet, for 400 feet. And the more staff, and there was more staff, including male, studying for the MPA qualification. In other words, the gun was put to their head, either study or get out. Nearly everybody here would remember Dr. James Herbert. He was appointed in that year. But there was an interesting thing at that particular time. You must remember, partition had been created in 1922, and the Northern Ireland government was in, and all staff in the hospital, the mental hospital, were required to swear an oath of allegiance. And the auditor declared that the Reverend W.J. O'Neill, PP, chaplaincy was declared null and void of his failure to make declaration of allegiance, and the committee was surcharged for payment, £50, 16 shillings and sixpence. Now, that was the first year of the Northern Ireland administration, and the following year the patients were well down to 767 patients. But the interesting thing was that the registrar in lunacy for chancery cases still visit the hospital from Dublin, so there was an interlinkage between the north and the south. They hadn't everything ironed out, and the registrar in charge of chancery, the patients, he inspected Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, or the Omagh Mental Hospital being called then, because the linkage hadn't been completely severed. But we're back to friend O'Neill again, Reverend W.J. O'Neill, PP, and the committee was surcharged £65, 9 shillings and sixpence. Well, that's 2 years in a row. I just wonder what means they got of recouping the money, or I'm fairly sure the committee didn't pay it, but it went down to coal or matches or blankets or something that had been hidden in the account somewhere, the 2 year surcharge. But that was an interesting aspect of it then. In 1924, they didn't use any town water at all, and things were looking up. We're down to 1 staff to 9 patients. But we're still only £1 per annum for the MPA qualification. But the attendant's wife, she had scored. She was up to £15 now for the Gate Lodge, for the free house, fuel and light. And the married attendants living outside the hospital now got £6 per annum towards the rent of a cottage. And all married attendants got 10 shillings yearly towards bog rent, mark this, and free patient labour for securing their turf. RMS wasn't getting everything. The acreage was back to 211 acres, but never really, it was rented land that had boosted it up before, and I think there was a mistake in their figures in those days. But 1925, the water from the artesian wells proved inadequate, even with the augmentation from town supplies. There has been a problem with the water at Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital from the day it was built until 1936. It was an ongoing problem. And the inspector suggested that one bar should be modernised, and shaving with safety razors came into being for the first time in 1925. Prior to that, the beards were clipped, and shaving with safety razors came into being in 1925. And the farm was still 211 acres, but they had rented 28. 1926, we're moving on, and Northern Ireland Office had got us, our Northern Ireland administration had got us act together, and the registrar for lunacy for the Northern Ireland sensory patients came from Belfast. And the RMS reported that alcohol was not seen as a potent cause of insanity. Alcoholism was not common in the neighbourhood. Mightn't have been in 26, but In 96 it is. But he reckoned it wasn't a reason for the patient's admissions to the hospital. And the inspector, he reported three sick cows suggesting tuberculosis and that the entire herd should be tested. Well, they were way ahead of their times then, because nobody ever tested a cow away in my early days. It had to be brought in by government enactment, and the inspector was trying to keep the thing right, at least. The water supply was still inadequate, and it impedes bathing, and water has to be carried for flushing. That'll be the lavatories. And the inspector said, you should get some help from outside to fix the pumping plant. In other words, the maintenance men at the hospital weren't doing their job, and get somebody in that knows his job. 776 patients, and there's a farm patient drowned. In the coroner, he suggested that the outer doors of all the corridors should be locked as soon as the patients were in from the farm. That's a vast change from the open house policy that has been operating now for a very long time, but that was the coroner's suggestion. And they bought 35 acres in that particular year, 27. 1928 was a funny year in a way. The farmyard was improved, and the cows were kept continuously indoors. Well, I had never heard of zero grazing as early as 1928, because that meant that the cows were kept continually indoors. The grass had to be cut and carted in to feed the cows, as well as the hay and everything made for their winter feed, and the cows were kept continuously indoors. And that's the first reference I come across of zero grazing, what we in modern days call zero grazing, and that was 1928. And 1929, there was fire drill monthly. Fire drill and no water, makes you think. And RMS, he was up to £900 a year. 1930, now you'll remember that was the period of the Great Depression, 1930s. And the farm profits were down to £57, 17 shillings and 10 pence. But the auditor, he disagreed with that. He said there was a loss actually of £54 rather than a profit of £57, and that was despite the farm account charging institute prices far in excess of the market prices. So with all their land and all their field labourers, there was bad management somewhere when they couldn't show a profit after charging the institute full over the market price for their produce. And the farm at that time was up to 246 acres, so they had got the land in. 14 acres bought, 35 acres. And 1936, that's the time we got the water situation under control, and we got it improved. The water tower and the river bridge was built, and they raised a loan of £3,600 to build the water tower, and I think the capacity of the water tower was 350,000 gallons. And that was the first time they were able to get water up to the upper stories of the hospital, because they had the height of the water tower to get the pressure, and that relieved the problems that had been ongoing from 1853 and was resolved in 1936 by the erection of the water tower. And the ferry across the river, it became redundant because the land that was bought in 1914, where the villas are, that had been serviced by a boat, a ferry on a chain, but now we had a bridge. And that bridge lasted until the villas were built, still there, but it was widened. And in 1936-39, the MEH hospital was built, the Mental Extension Hospital. That was built, and the architect was Vincent Murnison of Omagh. 36-39 it was built, and it was known as the MEH. And some of the students, when they came in, they were told MEH stood for Mickey Early's Hospital, because Mickey Early had been in the hospital for donkey's years, but they were soon disabused. Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital was the staff was some of the greatest staff one could ever meet. But if there's a chink in your armour, they were in through, and they could wind you up if they could, and they often did. Now, 48-49, Watterson's farm was bought. That was 41 acres, and it cost 4,100. That was £100 an acre. It was on the market today on the town land on the outside of Omagh, would make £1 million, without a doubt. There's no doubt about that. But it was bought for 41 acres for £4,100. And we really went modern then. The old horses, the horse, he got a bit of a rest because we bought a tractor and 2 trailers. And we had 323 staff with 851 patients, but now we could boast to be a 1,000-bed hospital. And we were really coming on in the world when we were a 1,000-bed hospital. That was no mean hospital. 52, up to 888 patients. 53, the coal yard was erected for £350. That's the coal yard round the base of the water tower. And 54, the famous David Barber, he retired after 23 years of service. And Harry Johnson, the chief male nurse, he retired after 35 service. And with 341 staff, we had 1,000 patients. We had made the big figure, we'd made the 1,000, and there was great jubilation in the hospital at that particular time because we'd made 1,000. The idea now is to try and keep them out, but in those days they were all chuffed. They were all chuffed because they were up to 1,000. And of course, if you're up to 1,000, that meant a certain gentleman got an increase in pay according to the amount of patients that you're looking after. Now, in 1955, the dual-purpose building was built. The new kitchens and cafeteria and the tuck shop was built, and the patient's dining room was built. Now you'd wonder what the dual-purpose building was. Now the dual-purpose building is what's known today as the clinic. And the reason it was called the dual-purpose building was that it was built with the war, the memory of the war still fresh in their minds, and was built for the dual purpose of, in times of war, it would be a place for wounded servicemen, for convalescents, for wounded servicemen, but in no times of war it would be an adjunct to Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. And that was, we called it originally the dual purpose building. It was later changed to the clinic. Fortunately, it has never been used for its dual purpose, and it has been absorbed into the Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital in its normal way. Oliver Evans was appointed then, and we're up to 1,021 patients. And Tyrone Drive, 1956, that was built, 8,000 Tyrone Drive, for £14,217, the Maitland's bungalow for £1,664, and the bathrooms and hot water systems were put into cranny cottages. And we had then got the marvellous total of a beddage hospital of 1,134, but we had 1,049 patients, but our hospital was reckoned to be 1,134. And we were very, very proud of the fact that we're the largest mental hospital in Northern Ireland outside Purgesburn. Downpatrick disputed that, but Omagh stuck tight to its guns that they were the second largest in the province. 58, the new mortuary was built, the recreation halls were remodelled, and I got a new Ferguson tractor. And we're up to 1,093 patients, and we really were going up the scale, and we're up to 393 staff. And in 59, the 10-foot gate that was bought in 1917, that was taken down. Now, the entire walls were knocked down. The old entrance and the pop gates and the pillars were knocked down, and the main entrance was reconstructed. And the 10-foot gates were removed. And we were then showing figures of 1,116 patients in 1959. And 1960 was a momentous year, for Tom Harron was appointed. Is Tom here? No, he's not. And there was 2 acres sold to the Omagh Rural Council, and that would have been where the Golden Villas are today. And we stepped forward into the future for patients' recreation. There's a bus bought for the patients' outings, a 27-seater, and we're up to 1,112 patients, and we're up to 425 staff. And the patients' garden plot scheme was started. In other words, the patients were encouraged to grow their plots up on Moores Hill. That's where the psychiatric villas are today, and they were encouraged to grow their stuff up there, and the hospital bought their produce, and that was a bit of pocket money for the patients. In 1961, a new hospital subcommittee was put in place. Old Miss Williams retired after 13 years service, and work started on Hazelwood and the medical staff bungalows, and we're down a wee bit there. We're down to 1,080 patients. We had come back a little. 1964 was really the year whenever the two places merged. The salaries and wages staff were the first to merge from Tyrone County and Tyrone Fermanagh, and that was my forte at that particular time. Old Wolf Kelly retired after 31 years service, but was immediately reappointed as a locum tenens. And the Cosy Corner Tuck Shop, that was operated by the patients. So what we really were doing, we were giving the patients something of initiative, something to do, something to give them an interest, rather than a place of digging with a spade and a place of incarceration. We've dropped again to 1,033 patients. And 1965, there's amalgamation of the hospital joint committees. They both came together. There was a bit of heart searching at that particular time. One thought they were being taken over by the other, but that's the way it happened. And the dairy herd was sold. And that was a source of great disappointment and chagrin to an awful lot of the patients, because they considered these pigs and the sheep and the cows, they were theirs. And when the dairy herd was sold in 1965, there was an awful lot of sad patients at that particular time. 66, Dr. Johnson retired after, and he was there since 1933, and Dr. G.E. Herbert, he retired as well the same year, and he was there since 22. So he had 44 years, another man had 33 years. And we're still decreasing in numbers. We're down to 1,028 patients, but we're up to 526 staff. Now, 1971, we built the new boiler house. Now, the old boilers that serviced the hospital before, there were 3 horizontal boilers. And they burned 13 tonne of coal a day. And that had to be all shoveled. And there was a patient shoveled them onto the horse and cart in the coal yard. And the horse was that well used and that well trained that when he got the word get up, he sauntered out and he stood on the weighbridge until the coal was weighed. And then he sauntered over to the boiler house and he put his head up beside the chapel and he reversed the cart back in to the boiler house, and the attendant or the patient, he pulled the lever and it tipped out, and the old horse could do that by himself without having to be told. And the new boiler house, that was taken over, and that, you must remember, was a boiler house that was designed to accommodate and service a brand new hospital that was planned in 1964, and the brand new hospital was to be a general psychiatric hospital, and it was to be on the Tyrone and Fermanagh site, with the eventual closing down of the Tyrone County Hospital. And the idea was the first building would be a maternity and gynecological services, and they would build on from that. And as they built the new hospital, they'd throw the old one out of the window, but it never happened. And the force then on the land was bought in 1914 across the river. There was 4 psychiatric villas built there, and 4 more in 1972. And farming ceased completely in 1971, and there's 187 acres left, and that was a sad day for a lot of the patients at Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. And believe it or not, we're down to 901 patients. We were coming down, but we were up to 614 staff. And 1873, the nurses' homes were being built. Now, it wasn't all that long before when we had built a mortuary and a new matron's bungalow down on that site. So we knocked those down, and we built a new mortuary at the back, and the matron she lived in, and we knocked those down, and we built the new nurses' home on top of it. And that was the plan, the 64 plan as well, that the new nurses' home would serve as the new hospital. That never happened, so therefore we had to put on transport to carry the nurses from the home, from the Tyrone and Fermanagh down to the Tyrone County Hospital. The new nurses' home, the new group mortuary was contracted for. Who remembers Dr. Gray? He retired that year on the 30th of 1973. George Gray used to drive a great big flashy Alvis. And the new nurses' home, it was contracted for, and they lowered the boundary wall. The boundary wall was taken down about 3 feet and a nice coping put on it, and made it a more pleasant thing to look at rather than a place of incarceration. But the height of the old wall still remains much the same from the gate lodge up behind the mortuary. It would have been the original height, but from the gates down to the bridge, it was lowered, and it helped the place no end. And the demolished old piggeries, no call for them, no land, no anything, and with a great fire in the laundry. And in the mid-70s, the geriatric buildings were built, and that more or less paid the patients' plots, and they were built up on Moores Hill, and they were built there. They're completely and utterly vast. And the tranny cottages that were built in 1903, they were demolished around 78, 80. And that more or less brings me to the end of my talk on Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital. 150 years after 1847, we have gone full circle back to a hospital that was designed for 300 people, to a hospital now that's only holding something like what, 240, 250? Is that right, John? 215. 215, worse again. 215, but we're left now with a hospital holding 215. We're left with A lovely, empty building, an awful lot of excess space that could have been used to good advantage 100 years before, but wasn't there. And Tyrone and Fermanagh Hospital, I would say, has gone back a lot. Maybe as medical science says it's gone forward, but with regard to staffing, patients, and the activity about the place, at one time it was a hiving institute. The kitchen were boiling 2,500 weights of potatoes a day to feed it. And you must remember, between patients and staff, there was a population there equivalent to Newton Stewart's population. So there was an awful lot of potatoes had to be eaten, and were so. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's my last word on the subject, but I'll leave you with a ray of hope and some crumbs of comfort. The lectures from now on, and the lecturers, can only improve. Thank you so much.
Many's a gay night, from dark till daylight, I spend with people of high renown. But in all their grandeur and heaps to squander, my heart would wander for sweet Omagh town.